Ask yourself this question. The world's most prestigious film festival is about to unfold over 12 days on the sun-drenched shores of the French Riviera. The red carpet will be rolled out. Flashbulbs will fire in every direction. Hundreds of cameras will position themselves outside the legendary Palais des Festivals in Cannes. Big names are coming. Julianne Moore, Kristen Stewart, John Travolta, Peter Jackson. The crowd will roar. The headlines will write themselves. But look closer. Look past the glamour and the designer gowns and the champagne glasses catching the Mediterranean light. Look for what should be there, but isn't. Because something massive is missing from this picture. Something that was once the beating heart of this festival's global appeal. No major Hollywood blockbuster is being launched at Cannes this year. Not one. Not from Disney. Not from Warner Brothers. Not from Universal. Not from Paramount. Zero. And that absence isn't an accident. It isn't a scheduling conflict. It isn't bad luck. It is the visible symptom of a war that has been building for years. A war over the soul of cinema itself. A war between two giants who once shared the same stage and now can barely speak the same language. Stay with me. Because when you understand what's really happening between Hollywood and Cannes, you will never watch a movie the same way again. It's 2024. The 77th Cannes Film Festival is days away from opening its doors. Festival director Thierry Frémaux has already held his press conference. He stood behind the podium with his glasses perched near the end of his nose, holding the program in both hands like a conductor holding a score. He spoke about the selection, he praised the films, he celebrated the names. But what he didn't say spoke louder than anything he did. No Marvel film, no DC film, no major studio franchise sequel, no summer tentpole with $100 million marketing budget behind it. The kind of film that fills multiplexes in Toledo and Tokyo and Toulouse simultaneously. That film was not coming to Cannes, and the reporters in that room knew it. BBC's Tom Brooke, covering the festival for Talking Movies, knew it. He had been following the relationship between Hollywood and Cannes for years, and this year something had shifted decisively. The big names were coming. Julianne Moore, Kristen Stewart, John Travolta, Peter Jackson. These were names that carried weight, names that could fill a press conference room and dominate a front page. But what they were bringing with them wasn't the kind of Hollywood product that once defined Cannes' global headlines. Something had changed. And to understand what, you have to go back further than this year. You have to go back to where the cracks first appeared. Everything in Hollywood begins with money. That's not a cynicism, it's a structural reality. And the relationship between Hollywood and Cannes was always, underneath all the artistry and the prestige, a financial relationship. For decades, Cannes served two purposes simultaneously. On one side, the official competition, the films, the jury, the Palme d'Or, the artistic evaluation. On the other side, the film market, a sprawling, chaotic, profitable ecosystem where rights were sold, distribution deals were struck, and the global business of cinema was conducted in hotel suites and beachside tents and crowded conference rooms. Hollywood studios understood Cannes primarily through the lens of the market. Bringing a film to Cannes meant accessing European distribution networks, closing international deals, generating the kind of critical prestige that could push a film across the line in awards season. It was expensive. Transporting cast and crew to France, organising screenings, running press tours, booking the hotels and the parties and the logistics. But the return could justify the cost. Until it couldn't. Because Cannes' jury had never been interested in Hollywood's product in the way Hollywood needed it to be. The films that won the Palme d'Or, the films that defined the festival's identity, were not the films that dominated the global box office. They were the films that challenged conventions, that introduced new voices, that took risks the studio system couldn't afford to take. A Marvel film at Cannes? The jury would look at it with the same polite, slightly bewildered expression that a concert pianist reserves for a very enthusiastic amateur. It wouldn't win. And if it couldn't win, What was the point of the expense? A few photographs? Some prestige by association? For Hollywood studios operating under quarterly earnings pressure and shareholder accountability, that calculus no longer worked. But money alone doesn't explain it. Because underneath the financial logic, there was something deeper. A philosophical rupture that had been widening for years. You cannot tell the story of Hollywood's retreat from Cannes without saying one name: Netflix. In 2017, Netflix arrived at Cannes with two films in competition: Bong Joon-ho's Okja and Noah Baumbach's The Meyerowitz Stories. Both films were in the main competition program. Both had legitimate artistic credentials. Both deserved to be there on pure cinematic merit. The French film industry erupted. The lobbying groups, the traditional distributors, the theatre owners. They weren't interested in artistic merit. They were interested in protecting a system. In France, films are required to follow a strict chronological window. They must play in theatres for a certain number of weeks before being available on any other platform. Netflix's model violated this principle at its core. A film that goes directly to a streaming service on the day of release, or shortly after, bypasses the theatrical window entirely. The French film lobby made their position clear. A film that won't play in French cinemas does not belong at Cannes. By 2018, the festival had formalized the rule. Any film entering the official competition must commit to a French theatrical release. This was not a gentle suggestion. It was a hard requirement. Netflix was effectively locked out of competition. And what Netflix's exclusion meant in practice went far beyond one streaming company. Because by 2024, the major Hollywood studios were all operating hybrid models. Disney Plus existed. HBO Max existed. Amazon Prime Video existed. Apple TV Plus existed. These platforms released studio films on a timeline that didn't always conform to the traditional theatrical window. The rigid French theatrical requirement created a structural incompatibility between how Hollywood distributed films and what Cannes demanded. Tom Brooke put it plainly. Cannes is trying to protect a model of cinema that Hollywood has already moved beyond. Neither side is wrong exactly, but they're playing completely different games. To understand why Cannes didn't simply adapt, why it held its line and let Hollywood drift further away, you have to understand what Cannes believes it is. The festival was founded in 1946. Europe was emerging from the ruins of World War II. Cinemas were reopening. People were rediscovering the experience of sitting together in the dark and watching light flicker on a screen. There was something profound in that act, a reclaiming of shared humanity after years of division and violence. Cannes was born as a celebration of that reclaiming. It was built on the belief that cinema was not just entertainment. It was art. It was culture. It was memory. It was the way a civilization told its story to itself. That founding belief became the festival's identity. Over the decades, Cannes positioned itself as the place where cinema's deepest ambitions were recognized and rewarded. European art cinema, independent voices, risk-taking directors, these were the heart of the festival. Hollywood, with its commercial logic and its franchise dependencies, was always somewhat of an uneasy guest at this particular table. And over time, that unease curdled into something more like incompatibility. Festival director Thierry Frémaux understood this dynamic completely. When asked at the press conference about the absence of major Hollywood productions, he smiled with the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed his answer carefully. Cannes has never been a festival of large budgets, he said. We are a festival of cinema. The line was elegant. It was also, in a quiet way, devastating to Hollywood's positioning. It said, you were never what we were about, and we have moved on. 2023 was a year of reckoning for Hollywood. Two major strikes, first the Writers Guild of America, then the Screen Actors Guild, shut down production across the industry for months. Sets went dark, films were delayed, release schedules were torn up and redrawn. The strikes were not just labor disputes, They were the visible explosion of tensions that had been building for years beneath the surface of Hollywood's seemingly unstoppable machine. At the core of the conflict was a transformation that had been accelerating since the rise of streaming. The fundamental restructuring of how money flows through the film industry. Writers who had once earned solid residuals from syndication and DVD sales were watching those income streams dry up as studios shifted to streaming platforms. Actors whose faces appeared on billboards for major studio productions were struggling to make rent because streaming residuals were a fraction of what theatrical distribution once paid. And then there was the question that no one wanted to answer but everyone was asking: artificial intelligence. Studios were beginning to explore whether AI could be used to write scripts, generate background characters, de-age actors, recreate deceased performers' likenesses. Writers saw it as an existential threat. Actors saw it as one too. The strikes forced the industry to confront questions it had been avoiding. Cannes watched all of this and took a position. The festival announced that films submitted to the competition could not use AI-generated scripts. Human authorship was a requirement, not a preference. The festival planted a flag on one side of the debate that was tearing Hollywood apart. That flag planting made Cannes heroes to some and obstacles to others. And for studio executives trying to navigate the new landscape of AI-assisted production, Cannes' position was not a welcoming one. The strikes also had a more practical consequence. They created production gaps that pushed films back on their timelines. Projects that might have been finished and festival-ready for Cannes 2024 were still incomplete. The pipeline that fed major Hollywood productions into the international festival circuit had been interrupted. Tom Brooks' assessment was precise. Hollywood came into 2024 still recovering. Cannes came into 2024 with a clearer identity than it had in years. The distance between them had never felt wider. So why were Julianne Moore, Kristen Stewart, John Travolta, and Peter Jackson at Cannes? What brought them to the Riviera when the studios they had built careers inside weren't sending their blockbusters? Each of them represented something specific. And together, they told a story about where cinema's center of gravity was shifting. Julianne Moore arrived at Cannes with a film that sat outside the major studio system. The production was independent in structure, multinational in financing, personal in ambition. Moore had always navigated both worlds. She had appeared in studio films, but she had also never abandoned the independent films that gave her career its artistic credibility. At Cannes, she was in her element. She walked the red carpet with the quiet authority of someone who understood that the real conversation about cinema happened here, not in a multiplex in suburban America. Kristen Stewart carried a different kind of significance. She had a specific relationship with French cinema, had worked with French directors, had spent enough time in France to be considered by some French publications as almost an honorary part of their cultural conversation. The Hollywood system had made her globally famous through the Twilight franchise, but her most interesting work, the films that showed what she was actually capable of as an actress, had come in smaller, more daring productions. Cannes represented the world where that work was valued. And Stewart, for her part, seemed to understand that her presence at Cannes was a statement about which version of Hollywood she preferred. John Travolta's presence was more complex. Here was a man who had been, at various points in his career, at the absolute center of Hollywood's commercial machinery. Grease, Saturday Night Fever. Pulp Fiction had given him a second act that most actors only dream of. Now, at Cannes, he was carrying something different. A project that signaled a willingness to reinvent, to work outside the familiar structures, to take risks that the studio system rarely permitted its established stars to take. Cannes had always been a place where reinvention was not just tolerated, but celebrated. Travolta's presence suggested he understood that. Peter Jackson was perhaps the most interesting case of all. The creator of the Lord of the Rings trilogy, one of the most financially successful franchises in cinema history, was at Cannes with something that had nothing to do with hobbits or billion-dollar box office projections. Jackson had always been more complex than his franchise identity suggested. His early career was built on idiosyncratic, low-budget, deeply personal films. The franchise success had funded a scale of filmmaking that few directors ever achieve. But underneath that scale, the independent spirit had never entirely disappeared. Cannes was where that spirit was recognized. Together, these four figures made an argument, perhaps not consciously, but compellingly, that the most interesting work being done by people who had passed through Hollywood's machinery was happening at the edges of that machinery, in the spaces where commercial obligation gave way to artistic freedom. The reason Cannes can hold its position, can resist Hollywood's gravitational pull, can enforce rules that exclude powerful streaming platforms, can prioritize artistic criteria over commercial ones, has everything to do with how France understands culture. France does not treat culture as a product. This is not a rhetorical position, it is encoded in policy. The concept of l'exception culturelle, the cultural exception, is the principle that cultural goods, including cinema, cannot be treated like other commodities subject to free market rules. Culture carries something that a refrigerator or a pair of shoes does not: the identity, memory, and imagination of a people. To subject it entirely to market logic is to allow it to be destroyed by the market. This principle is why France maintains quotas for French-language content on television. It's why the French government subsidizes the national film industry. It's why the theatrical window rule exists, and it's why Cannes can defend a position that, from a purely commercial standpoint, seems counterproductive. The French cinema lobby understood that if Cannes opened its competition to Netflix and the streaming model, it would effectively be validating the dismantling of the theatrical system that French film culture depends on. The lobby fought, and won, to keep that gate closed. For Hollywood, this looked like protectionism dressed up as principle. For France, it looked like the only rational defense of something irreplaceable. Frémaux, asked about this tension, offered a characteristically precise response. We believe in the cinema experience. We believe that a film watched in a theatre, in the dark, with an audience, is a different and more complete experience than a film watched on a screen at home. We are defending that experience. Whether that defense can hold in the long term, whether the theatrical experience can survive the convenience of streaming, whether Cannes' position will seem prescient or stubborn in 20 years, is a question that nobody can answer yet. But for now, Cannes is holding the line. Here is the paradox that rarely makes the headlines. Hollywood wasn't absent from Cannes. It just wasn't visible in the way the cameras were looking for. In the corridors of the Palais, in the bars of the Hotel Martinez and the Carlton, on the yachts anchored in the harbour with their discreet invitations and their closed-door meetings. In the Cannes film market, which runs parallel to the festival and has its own separate identity, its own badged entrance, its own frantic schedule of screenings and pitch meetings and negotiation sessions. Hollywood's deal-makers were there, the acquisition executives, the international distribution specialists, the producers looking for European co-production partners, the agents trying to attach their clients to films that might have festival momentum behind them. They hadn't brought blockbusters to launch, but they hadn't left the building either. A Hollywood producer, speaking to a journalist anonymously during that year's festival, put it with a directness that no official statement could match. "We are here. We are just not where you're looking for us." That anonymous comment contained more truth about the Hollywood-Cannes relationship than 100 press releases. The relationship had not ended. It had evolved into something more complicated, more transactional, and less publicly visible. Hollywood needed Cannes' markets, even if it no longer needed its prizes. Cannes needed Hollywood's talent, even if it no longer needed its blockbusters. It was a marriage that had stopped being romantic, but hadn't yet decided to file for divorce. While Hollywood's absence was generating headlines, the more important story at Cannes 2024 was not about what was missing, but about what was thriving. South Korean cinema had changed the conversation at Cannes permanently when Bong Joon-ho's Parasite won the Palme d'Or in 2019. That victory wasn't just a triumph for one film or one director. It was a declaration that the center of world cinema was no longer fixed in Hollywood or even in Europe. It was moving. It was multiplying. It was finding new expressions in places the established industry had underestimated for too long. Japanese cinema, Brazilian cinema, Iranian cinema, Romanian cinema, Indian independent film. Each year at Cannes, these voices grew stronger, more assured, more recognized by the jury and the press and the international audience. And Hollywood's withdrawal, gradual, structural, shaped by market logic and festival rules and labor disputes, created space for those voices to expand. When the room is no longer dominated by one very loud speaker, the quieter speakers can finally be heard. Tom Brooke reflected on this dynamic with genuine enthusiasm. "There's an argument," he said, "that Cannes is actually better without the Hollywood blockbuster machine, that the festival is returning to something closer to its founding purpose. Whether you find that exciting or alarming probably depends on what you love most about cinema." At a panel discussion held during the festival, one of dozens of industry events that run alongside the official program, a question was raised that crystallized the entire conflict. A moderator, speaking to a panel that included critics, distributors, and festival programmers from multiple countries, asked, "Is Cannes still relevant to global cinema? Or has it become a beautiful museum, important, respected, but no longer the place where the future is being decided?" The room went quiet for a moment. Not the uncomfortable quiet of embarrassment, the charged quiet of a question that everyone present had been thinking about and nobody had been willing to ask directly. One of the panelists, a critic who had been covering Cannes for over 2 decades, leaned forward. "Cannes is relevant," she said, "but not in the same way it was relevant 30 years ago. 30 years ago, winning at Cannes could change the commercial trajectory of a film. Now, winning at Cannes guarantees critical attention, but the commercial impact is harder to trace. The market has fragmented, the audience has fragmented. Cannes is one voice among many. A very important voice, but one voice." Another panelist, a distributor from a mid-sized European company, pushed back. "I would say Cannes is more relevant than ever for a specific kind of filmmaker. For the independent voice, the new director, the risk-taking project that wouldn't survive in a studio development system, Cannes is still the most important place in the world to be seen. For that filmmaker, nothing has changed." "But for Hollywood," the moderator pressed. "Hollywood has its own ecosystem now," the distributor said. "Its own awards season, its own streaming awards, its own ways of generating prestige and recognition that don't require Cannes' validation. And Cannes has learned to build its identity without Hollywood's participation. It's not a divorce. It's more like two people who used to need each other realizing they've grown into something independent." The metaphor landed precisely. The room nodded. Cannes has survived every disruption that came its way. That history is worth remembering. In 1968, at the height of the student uprisings that convulsed France, the festival was shut down mid-program. François Truffaut, Jean-Luc Godard, Roman Polanski, directors who had built their careers partly through Cannes' recognition, took the stage and physically stopped a screening in solidarity with the students and workers in the streets. The festival board agreed to cancel the remaining program. It was the most dramatic interruption in Cannes' history. The following year, Cannes came back. It adapted. It survived. In the 1990s, Quentin Tarantino's Pulp Fiction winning the Palme d'Or represented a brief, electric convergence of Hollywood independent cinema and Cannes' values. That period felt like proof that the two worlds could coexist, could even nourish each other. Harvey Weinstein's Miramax became the bridge between American independent film and the European festival circuit. That bridge eventually collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, creative, financial, and ultimately moral. But while it lasted, it showed what was possible. Now the question is whether a new bridge can be built. Not between Hollywood blockbusters and Cannes' jury, which seems increasingly unlikely, but between the independent American filmmakers who still work in the tradition that Cannes values, the directors who haven't abandoned risk, who haven't surrendered to franchise logic, and the festival that was built to recognize exactly that kind of work. That bridge may already be under construction. It's just being built more quietly than the ones before it. On the opening night of Cannes 2024, when the lights went down and the opening film began, the theatre was full. Every seat was taken, the press gallery was packed. The audience was quiet in the way that only a film audience at its best is quiet. Present, attentive, ready to be moved. And the film that played, without the familiar franchise logo, without the $100 million visual effects, without the tie-in merchandise and the sequel announcement and the global marketing saturation, did something that the biggest Hollywood productions struggle to do. It was entirely itself. No compromise had shaped it into something more palatable for a mass market. No test screening had sanded down its edges. No studio note had inserted a happier ending or a more relatable protagonist. It was the film its director had wanted to make, carried by the performances of actors who had chosen it because they believed in it. Whether it was a great film, whether it deserved its place in the competition program, whether it would be remembered in 10 years, those were questions the jury would answer. But in those first minutes, when the audience settled into its presence, something real was happening in that room. Something that justified the entire elaborate, expensive, occasionally absurd ceremony that surrounds it. Tom Brooke, filing his report from the Riviera for BBC Talking Movies, captured it with the precision of someone who had been watching this particular human theatre for a long time. Hollywood's absence, he said, is the most interesting thing about Cannes this year, not because it represents failure on either side, but because it forces a question that the industry has been avoiding. What is cinema actually for? Hollywood will not disappear from Cannes permanently. History suggests that the relationship will find new forms, new points of contact, new reasons to exist. There is too much mutual interest, financial, cultural, reputational, for a complete and permanent separation. But the easy relationship of the past, when Hollywood could bring its most expensive, most visible product to the Riviera and expect Cannes to welcome it with open arms, that relationship is over. What replaces it will say something important about what the industry has learned from this period of disruption. About whether Hollywood's best creative voices can find a way back to the kind of risk-taking that Cannes was built to reward. About whether Cannes can hold its position in a world where the audience's attention is more fractured than at any point in cinema's history. The red carpet will still be rolled out next year. The flashbulbs will still fire. The Palme d'Or will still be awarded to a film that most Americans will never see in a theatre. But the conversation happening beneath the glamour, the negotiation about what cinema is, who it belongs to, and what it should be allowed to become, that conversation has never been more consequential. Hollywood knows it. Cannes knows it. The rest of us are just beginning to understand what's at stake.